The scorching summer sun beat down mercilessly on the Colorado prairie, as Lillian Frost clutched her fading hope along with the reins of her exhausted mare. 3 days into her journey to Westcliff with dwindling water supplies, the 22-year-old schoolteacher's vision began to blur, the endless horizon wavering like a mirage before her eyes. She had been so certain of her decision to leave Denver, to start anew where nobody knew her name or the scandal that had driven her away. Now, as her parched lips cracked and her head pounded with each beat of her heart, she wondered if she'd made a fatal mistake. Miles Bennett spotted the lone rider from half a mile away, a peculiar sight on this seldom traveled stretch between settlements. The 30-year-old cattle driver had been making his way back to Westcliff after delivering a herd to the railroad when he noticed the horse's uneven gait and the slumped figure in the saddle. Something wasn't right. Adjusting his hat against the glare, he urged his stallion forward, dust billowing behind him as he closed the distance between them. Lillian heard the approaching hoofbeats, as if through a dense fog. She tried to straighten, to appear composed despite her distress, but her strength had abandoned her hours ago. The last thing she remembered was the sensation of sliding sideways, the world tilting at an impossible angle before everything went black. Miles reached the woman just as she collapsed, sliding from her saddle into the unforgiving dust of the trail. He dismounted in one fluid motion, kneeling beside her still form. Her face was flushed an alarming shade of red, her skin hot to the touch. Heatstroke, he'd seen it before, and he knew that, without immediate help, she wouldn't survive another hour under the brutal Colorado sun. With practiced hands, he uncorked his canteen and gently lifted her head, pouring a few precious drops of water onto her cracked lips. "Miss, can you hear me?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a note of urgency as he sought shelter from the relentless sun beneath the sparse branches of a nearby cottonwood tree. She didn't respond, but her eyelids fluttered briefly. It was enough to give Miles hope. He gathered her limp form into his arms and carried her to the meager shade, laying her down carefully on his bedroll. There was no question in his mind about what needed to be done. He would stay with this stranger until she recovered, or die trying. Something about her face, peaceful despite its alarming color, stirred a protectiveness in him he hadn't felt in years. "Don't you worry, miss," he murmured, dampening his bandana to place across her forehead. "I'm not going anywhere." As the afternoon stretched into evening, Miles kept vigil. He moistened her lips regularly, spoke in low, soothing tones, and prayed to a god he'd mostly ignored since losing his family's ranch 5 years earlier. When the woman's fever finally broke shortly after sundown, he felt a relief so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. Lillian regained consciousness to the smell of coffee brewing and the soft crackling of a small campfire. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. The last thing she remembered was the endless trail and the feeling that her skin might burst into flame beneath the merciless sun. She tried to sit up, a small groan escaping her lips as her head throbbed in protest. "Easy there," a deep voice cautioned. A man emerged from the shadows, crouching beside her with a tin cup of water. "Take small sips, you've been out for hours." Lillian stared at the stranger, taking in his weathered face and kind eyes beneath the brim of a well-worn cowboy hat. "Who?" her voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Miles Bennett," he offered, helping her sit up enough to drink. "Found you collapsed on the trail." Heatstroke's no small matter out here. She accepted the water gratefully, allowing the cool liquid to soothe her parched throat before attempting to speak again. "Lillian Frost," she managed. "Thank you for stopping." Miles nodded, settling back on his heels. "Where were you headed, Miss Frost? Not many travel this route alone, especially not." He caught himself before saying especially not a woman, but Lillian understood the unspoken words. "Westcliff," she replied. "I'm to be the new schoolteacher." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well, that's a coincidence. I'm headed back there myself. My ranch is just outside town, Ranch, Lillian's brow furrowed. I thought you were a cowboy. Miles chuckled, the sound warm in the cool night air. Every rancher's a cowboy at heart, Miss Frost, but I've got a small spread of my own. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. As they talked, Lillian gradually pieced together the events that had led to their meeting. Miles had found her unconscious, had carried her to shade, had tended to her for hours without knowing if she would recover. He'd stayed when many would have considered leaving her at the nearest settlement. The realization brought a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the lingering effects of heatstroke. "You should rest," Miles said finally, noticing her fatigue. "We're still a day's ride from Westcliff, and you're in no condition to travel before morning." Lillian wanted to protest it wasn't proper for her to camp alone with a strange man, but exhaustion and practicality won out. Besides, there was something about Miles Bennett that inspired trust. Perhaps it was the respect in his eyes when he looked at her, or the careful distance he maintained despite their close quarters. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," she murmured, settling back onto the bedroll. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." Miles tended the small fire, his face partially hidden in shadow. "No need for repayment, Miss Frost, just doing what anyone would do." But as Lillian drifted into sleep, she knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have stopped, not everyone would have stayed. The last thought that crossed her mind before slumber claimed her was that perhaps fate had a hand in their meeting after all. Morning arrived with a gentler sun than the previous day, though the heat still promised to be formidable. Lillian awoke feeling significantly improved, though still weak. She found Miles already awake, preparing a simple breakfast of biscuits and jerky. "There's coffee if you're feeling up to it," he offered, gesturing to the pot nestled in the coals. Lillian smoothed her disheveled hair, acutely aware of her appearance after a night sleeping rough. "I must look a fright," she murmured, accepting a cup. Miles glanced up, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to his task. "You look like someone who survived what kills many out here, Miss Frost. I'd say that's something to be proud of." His matter-of-fact tone eased her self-consciousness. As they ate, Lillian found herself studying her rescuer more carefully. His face was tanned from years under the sun, with laugh lines around his eyes suggesting a man acquainted with joy despite the hardships of frontier life. His hands were calloused but gentle, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in this harsh environment. "How long have you lived in Westcliff?" she asked as they packed up the modest camp. Miles secured a saddlebag before answering. "Going on 5 years now. Came west from Missouri after the war with nothing but determination and a handful of cattle. Westcliff was hardly more than a few buildings back then." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "Lost my family's land during the war, wanted to build something that was mine alone." Lillian nodded, understanding the need for a fresh start more than she cared to admit. "I came from Denver," she offered, though she volunteered no further details about the circumstances of her departure. Miles seemed to sense her reticence and didn't press. Instead, he helped her onto her mare, which had recovered nicely overnight thanks to his care. "We'll take it slow today," he said, mounting his own horse. "Need to make sure you stay hydrated, plenty of stops in the shade." They rode side by side as the morning progressed, the conversation flowing more easily than Lillian would have expected with a stranger. Miles knew the land intimately, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his early days in the territory. He spoke of his small herd of cattle, the cabin he'd built with his own hands, and his hopes to expand his operation in the coming years. In turn, Lillian shared stories of her teaching experiences in Denver, carefully omitting the scandal that had forced her departure, a false accusation of impropriety with the married school superintendent, who had pursued her relentlessly until she rebuffed him. His revenge had been swift and devastating to her reputation, leaving her no choice but to seek employment elsewhere. Around midday, they stopped by a small creek to rest. Miles insisted that Lillian sit in the shade while he refilled their canteens and tended to the horses. Watching him move with such capable efficiency, she found herself wondering what it would be like to have such a man as a constant in her life, someone steadfast and reliable in a world that had proven to be anything but. "We should reach Westcliff by nightfall," Miles said as they prepared to resume their journey. "The boarding house where you'll be staying is run by Mrs. Hopkins' Salt of the Earth, but she'll talk your ear off if you let her." Lillian smiled at his description. "I look forward to meeting her. I hope my room is still available, considering I'm arriving later than expected." "Don't worry about that," Miles assured her. "Westcliff may be growing, but we're not overrun with newcomers yet. Your room will be waiting." As they continued their journey, the landscape began to change subtly. The vast prairie gave way to gently rolling hills, and in the distance, the majestic peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rose against the blue sky. Lillian found herself enchanted by the wild beauty of it all, so different from the crowded streets of Denver. "It's breathtaking," she murmured almost to herself. Miles followed her gaze to the mountains. "That it is. Still takes my breath away sometimes, even after all these years." He paused, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "I hope you'll find happiness here, Miss Frost." The simple sincerity of his wish touched her deeply. "I hope so too, Mr. Bennett." By late afternoon, the first buildings of Westcliff came into view. Though small compared to Denver, the town had a bustling energy that surprised Lillian. The main street featured several businesses: a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and various other establishments necessary for frontier life. People moved about with purpose, nodding respectfully to Miles as he and Lillian rode past. "The schoolhouse is just beyond the church," Miles pointed out as they passed a modest white building with a small steeple. "Classes have been held in the church basement since the previous teacher left, but the town council finished the new building last month. They're mighty proud of it." Lillian felt a flutter of anticipation at the sight of what would be her new workplace. "It looks perfect," she said, already imagining the children who would fill it with life and learning. They continued to the boarding house, a two-story structure with a welcoming porch and window boxes filled with bright flowers. Before they had even dismounted, the door flew open, and a plump woman with silver-streaked hair hurried out. "Miles Bennett. We were beginning to wonder if you'd fallen off the face of the earth." She stopped short upon noticing Lillian. "And who might this be?" Miles helped Lillian dismount before answering. "Mrs. Hopkins, this is Miss Lillian Frost, Westcliff's new schoolteacher. Miss Frost, this is Mrs. Beatrice Hopkins, purveyor of the finest meals and gossip in Colorado territory." Mrs. Hopkins swatted at him good-naturedly before extending a hand to Lillian. "Welcome to Westcliff, Miss Frost. We've been eagerly awaiting your arrival." "Thank you," Lillian replied, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must appear after her ordeal. "I apologize for my delay. I had some trouble on the trail." Mrs. Hopkins' eyes widened as Miles briefly explained the circumstances of their meeting. "Good heavens, you poor dear. Thank the Lord Miles found you when he did." She ushered Lillian toward the door. "Come inside this instant. A hot bath and a proper meal are what you need." Lillian turned to Miles, reluctant to part ways so abruptly with the man who had saved her life. "Mr. Bennett, no need for thanks, Miss Frost," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm just glad I happened along when I did." He tipped his hat. "I'll look in on you tomorrow if that's acceptable. Make sure you're recovering properly." "I'd like that," she replied, surprised by how much she meant it. As Mrs. Hopkins led her inside, Lillian glanced back to see Miles still standing there, watching. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that their chance meeting on the trail might be the beginning of something neither had anticipated. True to her word, Mrs. Hopkins quickly arranged for a bath to be brought up to Lillian's room, a modest but comfortable space with a small window overlooking the main street. The hot water was heavenly after days on the trail, and the clean clothes Lillian changed into made her feel human again. At dinner, she met the other boarders. Mr. Peterson, the elderly telegraph operator, the Wilcox sisters, middle-aged dressmakers who spoke in tandem, and Mr. Greenwood, a quiet man who worked at the assayer's office. All welcomed her warmly, expressing their delight that the school would finally have a proper teacher again. "The children have been running wild for months," Miss Edith Wilcox declared. "Absolutely feral," her sister Evelyn agreed with a nod. "Not feral, Mrs. Hopkins corrected, serving a generous portion of beef stew to Lillian. "Just in need of proper guidance, which I'm certain Miss Frost will provide." The conversation turned to town news and gossip, with Lillian mentioned as Mrs. Hopkins' main interest at the moment. "It's most fortunate that Miles found you when he did," she said, refilling Lillian's water glass. "He's a good man, though he keeps mostly to himself since coming here." Lillian's interest piqued. "Has he no family in the area?" Mrs. Hopkins shook her head. "Lost his parents and younger brother during the war. Family farm in Missouri was right in the path of those dreadful border raids. He came west afterward, determined to start fresh." She lowered her voice, though everyone at the table could clearly hear. "Broke more than a few hearts in town when he first arrived, handsome as he is, but he's never shown serious interest in any of the eligible ladies." "Mrs. Hopkins," Mr. Peterson interjected with a chuckle, "perhaps we shouldn't subject Miss Frost to all our gossip on her first evening." The landlady had the grace to look sheepish. "You're right, of course. Forgive me, Miss Frost. An old woman's bad habit." Lillian smiled, finding Mrs. Hopkins' forthright nature refreshing after the veiled conversations and hidden agendas she'd endured in Denver. "There's nothing to forgive. It's kind of you all to make me feel so welcome." After dinner, pleading fatigue from her journey, Lillian retired to her room. As she prepared for bed, her thoughts turned to Miles Bennett. His kindness had saved her life, yet he'd asked for nothing in return. In her experience, men rarely acted without expectation of reward, especially when dealing with a woman alone and vulnerable. His respectful behavior throughout their time together stood in stark contrast to the unwanted advances she'd fled in Denver. Sitting at the small desk beneath her window, Lillian opened her journal and began to write, documenting her near-disastrous journey and the cowboy who had come to her rescue. The simple act of putting pen to paper helped organize her thoughts, a practice she'd maintained since childhood. By the time she finished, her eyelids were heavy with exhaustion. As she drifted off to sleep in her new bed in her new town, Lillian wondered what tomorrow would bring and whether Miles Bennett would indeed call on her as promised. The following morning, Lillian awoke feeling remarkably refreshed. After breakfast with her fellow boarders, she made her way to the schoolhouse, eager to see her new workplace before classes began the following week. The small building sat on the edge of town, freshly painted white with a row of windows along each side to capture the light. A sense of anticipation filled her as she climbed the steps and unlocked the door with the key Mrs. Hopkins had given her. Inside, the single room was simple but well constructed, with rows of desks facing a larger desk and blackboard at the front. Bookshelves lined one wall, sparsely populated with basic texts. Lillian ran her fingers along the smooth surface of her desk, already envisioning the lessons she would teach here, the minds she would help shape. This was her domain, a place where she could rebuild her reputation, and perhaps find the sense of purpose that had eluded her in Denver. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that the knock at the open door startled her. Turning, she found Miles Bennett standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "Mr. Bennett," she greeted him, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "You kept your word." He stepped inside, glancing around the schoolroom with approval. "Always do, Miss Frost. How are you feeling today?" "Much improved, thanks to your care." She gestured around the room. "What do you think of our schoolhouse?" Miles walked slowly around the space, examining the craftsmanship. "Fine work. I helped raise the walls myself, along with half the men in town." He turned to face her. The children need education if Westcliff is going to thrive. Most of us never had such opportunities growing up. His words revealed more about him than perhaps he intended. Lillian studied him with new interest. "Did you have much schooling, Mr. Bennett?" A self-deprecating smile crossed his face. "My mother taught me reading and basic ciphering. The rest I learned through living, not always the easiest way, but effective." "Education comes in many forms," Lillian agreed. "I suspect you could teach me a great deal about survival in this territory." "Perhaps we could arrange an exchange," Miles suggested. "Wilderness skills for—" "What would you offer in return, Miss Frost?" The question hung between them, layered with possibilities. Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks at the sudden intensity of his gaze. "Literature, perhaps," she answered finally. "Or history. I'm told I have a gift for bringing the past to life through stories." Miles nodded, something like admiration in his eyes. "I'd like that. Stories are in short supply out here sometimes." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mayor Simmons, a portly man whose enthusiasm for meeting the new teacher resulted in a lengthy tour of the town. Miles excused himself, mentioning ranch business that needed attention, but not before securing Lillian's permission to call on her again. The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Lillian met many of her future students and their parents, organized her teaching materials, and slowly began to feel like part of the community. Miles visited regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, a jar of honey from his hives, a book he thought she might enjoy, wildflowers gathered on his ride to town. Each visit strengthened the connection between them, though both maintained a careful propriety that respected Lillian's position. As the schoolteacher, she was held to the highest moral standards, a fact Mrs. Hopkins reminded her of frequently, though always with kindness. "A teacher is more closely watched than the preacher himself," she cautioned. "Unfair, perhaps, but that's the way of small towns." Lillian understood all too well. Her reputation had been destroyed once by malicious gossip. She wouldn't risk it again, not even for the increasingly distracting presence of Miles Bennett in her thoughts. The first day of school arrived with perfect autumn weather. 28 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age filed into the schoolhouse, their faces a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and, in some cases, mischief. Lillian stood before them, outwardly composed though her heart raced with nerves. "Good morning," she began. "I am Miss Frost, and I am honored to be your teacher." From the back row, a lanky boy with a shock of red hair called out, "Is it true a cowboy saved you from dying in the desert, Miss Frost?" Titters ran through the class. Lillian's momentary surprise gave way to a smile. Of course, the story would have spread throughout the small community. "It is true that Mr. Bennett came to my aid when I suffered from heatstroke," she acknowledged calmly. "And his actions provide us with our first lesson, the importance of preparation and knowledge when facing the natural world." She turned to the blackboard and wrote survival in large letters. "Who can tell me what supplies one should always carry when traveling in this territory?" The question redirected the children's attention, and the day proceeded more smoothly than Lillian had dared hope. By dismissal time, she had assessed her students' varying abilities and begun to form a teaching plan that would challenge each appropriately. As the children scattered toward home, Lillian noticed Miles leaning against the hitching post outside, seemingly deep in conversation with a man she recognized as Thomas Baker, owner of the general store. Both men tipped their hats as she emerged from the schoolhouse. "Miss Frost," Mr. Baker greeted her, "I hear you've made quite an impression on my Sarah. She's talked of nothing else all summer but having a proper teacher again." "Your daughter is bright and eager to learn," Lillian replied. "I look forward to working with her." Mr. Baker nodded, satisfied. "Well, I'll leave you two to your conversation. Good day, Miss Frost, Miles." With a knowing glance between them, he departed. Miles shifted slightly, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I hoped you might join me for a ride this Saturday," he said. There's a spot up in the foothills I thought you might enjoy. Perfect view of the valley. Mrs. Hopkins could pack us a picnic lunch. The invitation was innocuous enough, but Lillian hesitated. A ride alone with Miles would certainly cause talk, regardless of how innocent their intentions. Seeing her hesitation, he added quickly, Mayor Simmons' daughter Rebecca could accompany us as chaperone. She's a fine young lady, 17 now and responsible. His thoughtfulness in considering her reputation touched Lillian deeply. In that case, I'd be delighted to join you, Mr. Bennett. The smile that lit his face was worth any risk to her standing in the community. Excellent. I'll make the arrangements with Rebecca and Mrs. Hopkins. As promised, Saturday dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for a ride into the foothills. Miles arrived at the boarding house precisely at 10 o'clock, leading an extra horse for Lillian, and accompanied by Rebecca Simmons, a cheerful girl with practical sensibilities who clearly admired Miles. Miss Frost, I'm so excited you agreed to come, Rebecca enthused as they set out. The view from Whispering Pines is absolutely magnificent. Papa proposed to Mama there 20 years ago. The pointed comment brought a flush to Lillian's cheeks and caused Miles to clear his throat awkwardly. It's about an hour's ride, he said, changing the subject. The trail gets steep in places, but nothing your horse can't handle. The ride was pleasant, with Rebecca chattering amiably about town history and local lore. Miles mostly listened, occasionally adding details or correcting exaggerations with good humor. Lillian found herself relaxing in their company, laughing more freely than she had in months. The spot Miles had chosen for their picnic was indeed spectacular, a grassy clearing atop a ridge with panoramic views of the valley below and the mountains beyond. West Cliff looked like a child's toy town from this height, nestled among fields and pastures that stretched to the horizon. It's magnificent, Lillian breathed as Miles helped her dismount. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, the brief contact sending an unexpected thrill through her. Rebecca busied herself with spreading the picnic blanket beneath a towering pine while Miles tended to the horses. The girl's pointed humming as she arranged their lunch made it clear she was giving them a moment of privacy. Thank you for suggesting this, Lillian said quietly as Miles joined her at the edge of the clearing. I hadn't realized how much I needed to escape the town, if only for an afternoon. He studied her face, teaching going well, very well, but it's intense. Every moment I'm observed, every action judged, she sighed. I understand why parents entrust their children to me, but sometimes I feel as though I can't simply be myself. Miles nodded, his eyes reflecting understanding. Small towns have long memories and quick judgments. I felt that scrutiny when I first arrived. And now, a slow smile spread across his face. Now I've earned the right to my privacy. People respect that I keep to myself, though they still speculate. About, his eyes held hers. Why a man my age hasn't taken a wife, whether I'm married to my ranch or simply haven't found a woman who could tolerate my stubborn ways. The directness of his answer caught Lillian off guard. Before she could formulate a response, Rebecca called them to lunch, effectively ending the private moment. The picnic was delicious. Mrs. Hopkins had outdone herself with fried chicken, potato salad, fresh bread, and apple tarts. The conversation flowed easily among the three of them, touching on everything from school affairs to cattle prices to Rebecca's hopes of attending a ladies' seminary in Denver the following year. After they'd eaten, Rebecca announced her intention to sketch the valley view, settling herself some distance away with a small drawing pad and pencils she'd brought along. Though still within sight, her deliberate removal granted Lillian and Miles a measure of privacy while maintaining propriety. She's a good girl, Miles commented, stretching his long legs before him as they sat side by side on the picnic blanket. Smart too, reminds me a bit of my mother, practical but with dreams bigger than this valley. You speak of your mother with such fondness, Lillian observed. Would you tell me more about your family, unless the memories are too painful? Miles was quiet for so long that Lillian feared she'd overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with remembrance. My father was a stern man but fair. Taught me everything about cattle and horses, about reading the weather and respecting the land. My mother was his opposite, all warmth and laughter, with a love of books that seemed almost scandalous to our neighbors. He smiled at some private memory. My brother Jacob was 10 years younger, a surprise child they called their sunset blessing. I was more like a second father to him than a brother. What happened to them? Lillian asked gently. Miles gazed out over the valley. Quantrill's Raiders, August of '63. I was away fighting with the Union forces when they swept through our county, burning farms and killing indiscriminately. His jaw tightened. By the time I received word and made it home on emergency leave, there was nothing left but ashes and 3 fresh graves dug by neighbors. Lillian reached out instinctively, covering his hand with hers. I'm so sorry, Miles. He turned his hand to clasp hers, the gesture natural despite its intimacy. For a long time, I couldn't see beyond that loss, couldn't imagine building anything new when everything I loved had been destroyed. His eyes met hers. Coming west saved me, forcing myself to start again, to create something from nothing. It gave me purpose when I had none. The rawness of his confession moved her deeply. In that moment, Lillian recognized that Miles Bennett understood loss in a way few others could. Perhaps that was why she felt so drawn to him. They were both rebuilding lives that had been shattered, though by very different circumstances. Thank you for sharing that with me, she said softly. I know how difficult it can be to speak of painful memories. Miles studied their still joined hands. I haven't told anyone here the full story, most know bits and pieces, but he trailed off, looking almost surprised at himself. Something about you makes it easier to talk about the past. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Lillian was acutely aware of their isolation, of Rebecca's distant figure, of the warmth of Miles' hand against hers. For a breathless moment, she thought he might lean closer, might cross the invisible boundary that separated teacher and rancher, proper acquaintances and something more. Instead, he gently released her hand and stood, offering her a smile that held both regret and promise. We should start back soon. Wouldn't want to worry Mrs. Hopkins. The ride back to town was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts. Rebecca, seemingly satisfied with her role in their outing, chattered less and observed more, occasionally exchanging knowing glances with Miles that Lillian pretended not to notice. At the boarding house, Miles helped Lillian dismount with the same careful attention he'd shown throughout their acquaintance. Thank you for joining me today, Miss Frost, he said formally, mindful of curious eyes that might be watching from windows. Perhaps we could make it a regular excursion. There are many beautiful spots around Westcliff worth exploring. I'd like that very much, Mr. Bennett, Lillian replied, equally formal though her smile conveyed deeper meaning. As autumn progressed into winter, those excursions indeed became regular, sometimes with Rebecca as chaperone, sometimes with one of the Wilcox sisters, occasionally with a group of townspeople for longer expeditions. Each outing deepened the connection between Lillian and Miles, building a foundation of friendship and mutual respect that gradually blossomed into something neither could deny was more significant. By December, their growing attachment had become the subject of gentle speculation throughout Westcliff. Mrs. Hopkins took particular delight in noting Miles' increased appearances at Sunday services and town functions, activities he'd largely avoided before Lillian's arrival. That man rides into town 3 times a week now, regular as clockwork, she commented one evening as Lillian helped with the dinner dishes. And it's not for the mail or supplies, I can tell you that much. Lillian focused intently on drying a platter. Mr. Bennett has been very kind in helping me become acquainted with the area. I appreciate his friendship. Mrs. Hopkins snorted softly. Friendship, is it? Well, I suppose that's what proper folk call it in the beginning stages. Her expression softened. He's different with you, Lillian. I've known Miles Bennett for 5 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. The observation sent a flutter of pleasure through Lillian's heart, though she maintained her composure. Mrs. Hopkins, you know as well as I do that my position requires the utmost propriety. The school board would not look kindly on a teacher engaged in a romantic entanglement. Poppycock, Mrs. Hopkins declared, setting down a pot with unnecessary force. This isn't Boston or New York, child. Half the school board are parents who see how their children have flourished under your teaching. They're not going to dismiss the best instructor this town has ever had over a proper courtship with a respected rancher. She wiped her hands on her apron decisively. Besides, if Miles Bennett finally works up the courage to declare himself, you'd be a fool to hesitate on account of a few stuffed shirts and their outdated notions. Lillian couldn't help laughing at the landlady's forthright assessment. If, Mrs. Hopkins, that's quite a significant if. Mark my words, the older woman replied with the confidence of long experience. That man didn't build a second bedroom onto his cabin last month for nothing. This news caught Lillian entirely by surprise. He's expanding his home. Mrs. Hopkins looked smug. According to Mr. Peterson, who heard it from Sheriff Davis, who helped with the roofing, 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a small sitting room with bookshelves built right into the wall. She raised her eyebrows meaningfully. Now, why would a confirmed bachelor need bookshelves, I ask you? The implication was clear, and Lillian found herself both flustered and secretly pleased by the thought that Miles might be preparing his home with her in mind. Still, she reminded herself not to get ahead of reality. They had shared conversations, rides, and increasingly meaningful glances, but nothing that could be construed as a formal declaration of intent. The annual Christmas social at the town hall provided the perfect setting for such a declaration, or so Mrs. Hopkins insisted as she helped Lillian prepare. The green wool dress they'd labored over for weeks fit perfectly, the darker trim highlighting Lillian's slender figure while maintaining appropriate modesty for a schoolteacher. There, Mrs. Hopkins said with satisfaction, adjusting the small cameo at Lillian's throat, a gift from her late mother and her only piece of fine jewelry. You'll be the loveliest woman there, though don't tell my niece Caroline I said so. The social was indeed a grand affair by Westcliff standards. Evergreen boughs and red ribbons decorated the town hall, lanterns cast a warm glow over the proceedings, and nearly everyone in town attended, dressed in their finest. A small band played lively tunes, tables groaned with holiday treats, and the air buzzed with conversation and laughter. Lillian was immediately surrounded by students and parents, all eager to chat with the teacher who had transformed their school in just a few months. She searched the room discreetly for Miles, but didn't spot him among the crowd. "He'll be here," Rebecca Simmons whispered, appearing at her elbow as if reading her thoughts. "Papa said he stopped by the ranch this afternoon to borrow his good shaving kit." Lillian felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sure I don't know who you mean, Rebecca." The girl grinned, unrepentant. "Of course not, Miss Frost. Just as I'm sure you're not watching the door every 30 seconds. Before Lillian could formulate a suitably dignified response, a hush fell over one section of the room. She turned to see Miles Bennett in the doorway, and her breath caught in her throat. Gone was the everyday cowboy in practical work clothes. In his place stood a striking figure in a well-cut dark suit, crisp white shirt, and string tie. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved save for his usual well-trimmed mustache. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment, it seemed to Lillian that everyone else faded into insignificance. Miles made his way toward her with purpose, nodding politely to those who greeted him, but never breaking his stride. "Miss Frost," he said when he reached her, his voice carrying a warmth reserved solely for her. "You look beautiful tonight." "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," she replied, suddenly shy despite the months of growing familiarity between them. "You look quite handsome yourself." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Had to dust off my Sunday best. Special occasion. Rebecca, displaying remarkable tact for her 17 years, excused herself to help her mother with the refreshments, leaving them in a bubble of relative privacy despite the crowded room. "Would you honor me with a dance?" Miles asked, extending his hand. Lillian hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I'd be delighted." The band was playing a waltz providential timing that Lillian suspected might have Mrs. Hopkins' orchestration behind it. Miles led her to the dance floor with confidence, his hand warm at the small of her back as they joined the other couples. "I should warn you," she said as they began to move with the music, "I haven't danced since leaving Denver." Miles guided her smoothly through a turn. "You dance beautifully, Lillian." The use of her given name, spoken softly for her ears alone, sent a pleasant shiver through her. "As do you, Miles. I confess I'm surprised," he chuckled, the sound rumbling from his chest. "My mother insisted. Said no son of hers would stumble around a dance floor like a newborn colt, no matter how far we lived from civilization." They moved together as if they'd danced 100 times before, the steps coming naturally, despite their limited physical contact over the previous months. Lillian was acutely aware of his hand at her waist, the subtle scent of bay rum and clean linen that surrounded him, the way his eyes never left her face. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Miles said as the music continued. "Would you join me for Christmas dinner at my ranch?" The invitation was significant, they both knew it. Until now, their interactions had been public or properly chaperoned. A private dinner at his home represented a crossing of boundaries, a deliberate step toward something more defined. "I'd need to make arrangements with Mrs. Hopkins," Lillian said, her voice steadier than she felt. "She's planning a Christmas meal for all the boarders." "I've already spoken with her," Miles admitted. "She suggested I collect you after the morning meal and return you before it grows too late." A hint of vulnerability crossed his features. "I'd like to show you my home, Lillian, the place I've been building, with hopes for the future." The implication hung between them, neither willing yet to speak more plainly in such a public setting. Lillian's heart raced as she considered his words and all they suggested. "Yes," she said simply, "I'd like that very much." The relief and joy that transformed his face told her everything she needed to know about his feelings. For the remainder of the evening, they were seldom apart dancing, conversing with townspeople, sharing punch and Christmas cake at one of the small tables. When Miles finally escorted her back to the boarding house, the night air crisp with the promise of snow, Lillian felt as though her life in Westcliff had truly begun. Christmas Day arrived with a blanket of fresh snow that transformed Westcliff into a scene from a holiday card. After the morning gift exchange and meal at the boarding house, Lillian waited nervously for Miles to arrive with his sleigh. She had agonized over a gift for him, finally settling on a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool and a copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass that she'd ordered specially from Denver. Mrs. Hopkins fussed around her like a mother hen, adjusting Lillian's collar and offering last-minute advice that was equal parts practical and romantic. "Remember, dear, a man builds a home hoping to fill it with love. Don't be afraid to show him that you might be the one to provide it." The sleigh bells announced Miles' arrival before he even reached the door. Lillian gathered her packages and winter cloak, her stomach fluttering with anticipation that had nothing to do with Christmas excitement and everything to do with the day ahead. Miles stood on the porch, tall and handsome in his heavy coat, a smile breaking across his face at the sight of her. "Merry Christmas, Lillian," he greeted her, taking her parcels so she could secure her cloak. "Merry Christmas, Miles," she returned his smile, aware of Mrs. Hopkins watching approvingly from inside. The sleigh was beautiful polished wood, with comfortable seats covered in thick furs to ward off the cold. Miles tucked a heavy blanket around Lillian's legs before climbing in beside her and taking up the reins. With a musical jingling of bells, they set off through town toward the open country beyond. "It's about 3 miles to my place," Miles explained as they left the last buildings of Westcliff behind. "Not far in good weather, but I thought you'd enjoy the sleigh ride." "It's wonderful," Lillian assured him, enchanted by the pristine landscape unfolding before them. Snow-covered fields stretched to the distant mountains, the winter sun casting long shadows across the unblemished white expanse. The Bennett ranch came into view gradually, first the fenced pastures where cattle huddled together against the cold, then outbuildings including a barn and what appeared to be a workshop, and finally the cabin itself. Larger than Lillian had imagined, it sat nestled against a stand of pines that provided shelter from the wind, smoke curling invitingly from its stone chimney. "It's beautiful, Miles," she said sincerely as he helped her from the sleigh. Pride showed clearly in his expression. "It's not grand, but it's solid, built to last." He offered his arm. "Would you like to see inside?" The interior of the cabin was warm and welcoming, with a fire crackling in the stone hearth and the scents of pine and cinnamon hanging in the air. Lillian took in the main room with its comfortable furnishings, the kitchen area with its gleaming cookstove, and just as Mrs. Hopkins had reported, bookshelves built into one wall, still mostly empty but clearly crafted with care. "This is lovely," she said, removing her cloak and gloves as Miles hung them by the door. "You've created a real home here." "I hope so," he replied, watching her face carefully. "It's still missing something important." The air between them seemed charged with unspoken meaning. Lillian moved to the bookshelves, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "Is this what Mrs. Hopkins mentioned? Your recent addition?" Miles nodded, coming to stand beside her. "Along with a second bedroom and expanded kitchen. I figured it was time to think beyond just my own needs." Heart-pounding, Lillian turned to face him. "And what needs might those be, Miles Bennett?" He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "The needs of a man who's been alone too long, who finds himself thinking about a future that includes a wife, children, a family gathered around this hearth." His eyes, earnest and vulnerable, held hers. "A man who never expected to find someone who could make him feel this way again, but who walked into his life on a dusty trail and changed everything." Lillian's breath caught. "Miles, let me finish," he said gently. "I know we haven't known each other long by some standards. I know your position in town is important to you, and that you might have concerns about becoming a rancher's wife after the life you led in Denver. But I also know that I love you, Lillian Frost. I love your kindness, your intelligence, your courage. I love the way you've embraced life here, the way you care for your students, the way you look at me as if I might be worthy of a woman like you." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes at his heartfelt declaration. "Oh, Miles. Worthy doesn't begin to describe what you are." Taking her hands in his, Miles continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer. I understand if you need time to consider what I'm offering. But I want you to know that this home, this ranch, this life, I've been building it all with you in mind. Even before I knew you existed, I think I was waiting for you." Lillian felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The months of growing affection, of cautious friendship blossoming into something deeper, had led to this moment of perfect clarity. "I don't need time, Miles. I've known since that day at Whispering Pines, perhaps even before. I love you too." The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Miles drew her gently into his arms, one hand cradling her face as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever held. "May I kiss you, Lillian? I've been wanting to since the moment you opened your eyes on that trail." "Yes," she whispered, already lifting her face to his. Their first kiss was tender, a gentle meeting of lips that conveyed months of restrained longing and the promise of a future neither had dared hope for until now. When they parted, Miles rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "I should have brought you home months ago," he murmured. Lillian laughed softly. "Mrs. Hopkins would have had a conniption. Mrs. Hopkins has been plotting this since September," Miles countered, drawing back to look at her with amusement. She cornered me after church one Sunday and informed me that if I didn't make my intentions clear before spring planting, she'd take matters into her own hands. That explains a great deal, Lillian said, thinking of the landlady's increasingly transparent matchmaking efforts. Miles brushed a strand of hair from Lillian's face, his touch reverent. I have something for you, a Christmas gift, though it's more than that. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. This belonged to my mother. I've kept it safe all these years, waiting for the right woman to wear it. From the pouch, he produced a delicate gold ring set with a small diamond flanked by 2 sapphires. It's not fancy or modern, he said apologetically. If you'd prefer something else, it's perfect, Lillian interrupted, deeply moved by the sentiment behind the gift. Absolutely perfect. Miles took her left hand, his own trembling slightly. Lillian Frost, will you marry me? Will you make this house a home, share my life, build a future here with me? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Yes to all of it, Miles. He slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if made for her. Then he kissed her again, more deeply this time, his arms encircling her waist as hers wound around his neck. The kiss held all the passion they had restrained during months of proper courting, all the longing neither had fully acknowledged until now. When they finally parted, both breathless, Miles looked dazed with happiness. I had a whole speech prepared, arguments for why you should consider my proposal despite the changes it would mean for your life. Lillian smiled, touching his face gently. What changes? I'll still teach at least until we have children who need my attention. Westcliff is growing, soon we'll need more than one teacher anyway. You'd want to continue teaching, even after we marry, for a while. Yes, I love it, Miles, just as you love this ranch. She looked around the cabin that would soon be her home. But I want this too, our life together, our family, I want all of it. Miles shook his head in wonder. How did I get so lucky? The day I found you on that trail was the day both our lives changed, Lillian finished for him. Though I could have done without the heatstroke, he laughed, the sound filled with joy. I have dinner prepared. Should we celebrate our engagement with a Christmas feast? I'd like that, Lillian agreed. But first, she retrieved her packages from where they sat near the door. Your Christmas gifts, though they seem inadequate now. Miles unwrapped the scarf first, immediately winding it around his neck with appreciation. Perfect for winter rides, he declared. When he opened the book, his expression softened. Whitman, I've heard of him but never read his work. I thought we could read it together, Lillian suggested. He writes beautifully about America, about nature and love and the human spirit. Miles leafed through the pages, pausing at a marked passage. We were together. I forget the rest, he read aloud. His eyes met hers over the book. I think I'm going to like Mr. Whitman very much. They prepared Christmas dinner together, moving around the kitchen with an ease that suggested they'd done so many times before. Miles had planned everything carefully, a small roast, potatoes, winter vegetables from his root cellar, and an apple pie purchased from the town bakery. They talked of plans for the future as they cooked and ate a spring wedding after the worst of winter had passed, combining their lives while maintaining the independence each valued. I was thinking June, Miles suggested as they sat before the fire after dinner. Lillian nestled against his side. The wildflowers will be at their peak. We could have the ceremony at Whispering Pines. That would be perfect, Lillian agreed, admiring how her ring caught the firelight, though Mrs. Hopkins will insist on hosting the reception at the boarding house. Of course she will, Miles chuckled. I wouldn't dare suggest otherwise. The afternoon passed in sweet contentment, alternating between planning their future and simply enjoying their newfound closeness. As twilight approached, Miles reluctantly mentioned the need to return Lillian to town before dark. I wish you could stay, he said, helping her with her cloak, but I want to do this properly, no gossip to tarnish what we're building. Lillian appreciated his consideration of her position. Soon enough, this will be my home too. We have time, Miles. The ride back to Westcliff was magical stars emerging in the clear winter sky. the sleigh bells jingling merrily, and the warmth of Miles beside her a constant reminder of the day's joyous turn. They agreed to announce their engagement formally at the New Year's celebration in town, though both knew Mrs. Hopkins would likely spread the news the moment she spotted the ring on Lillian's finger. At the boarding house door, Miles kissed her once more, a promise of the life awaiting them. "Merry Christmas, my love," he whispered against her lips. "Merry Christmas, Miles," she replied, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. The first of many. Their engagement announcement at the New Year's gathering was met with enthusiastic congratulations from the townspeople. If anyone had reservations about the schoolteacher marrying so quickly after her arrival in Westcliff, they kept such thoughts to themselves in the face of the couple's obvious happiness. The following months passed in a flurry of preparation. Lillian continued teaching while helping Miles complete the finishing touches on their home. Mrs. Hopkins threw herself into wedding planning with gusto, declaring it the social event of the year for Westcliff. The Wilcox sisters worked tirelessly on Lillian's wedding gown, an elegant creation of ivory satin with delicate lace that transformed the practical schoolteacher into a vision of bridal beauty. June arrived with perfect weather, as if nature itself approved of their union. The ceremony at Whispering Pines was intimate and deeply moving, with Reverend Clark officiating as Miles and Lillian exchanged vows beneath a canopy of blue sky and swaying pines. Lillian's students had created a path of wildflowers leading to the makeshift altar, and many wiped tears as their beloved teacher became Mrs. Bennett. The celebration afterward at the boarding house lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing under lantern light in the yard. When Miles finally swept his bride away to begin their life together, the entire town cheered them on their way. Their wedding night was everything Lillian had dreamed: tender, passionate, and filled with the wonder of two people who had found in each other the love they'd thought might never be theirs. As she drifted to sleep in her husband's arms, Lillian thought of the seemingly disastrous journey that had brought her to Westcliff, to Miles, to this perfect happiness. "What are you smiling about?" Miles murmured sleepily, his arms tightening around her. "I was just thinking," she replied, nestling closer, "that sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I thank God every day that I found you on that trail, and that you stayed," Lillian added softly. "That you poured water on my lips and stayed." "I'll always stay," Miles promised, "for all the days of our lives." In the years that followed, the Bennett Ranch flourished alongside their family. Lillian continued teaching until the birth of their first child, a son they named Jacob after Miles' lost brother. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, then another son, William, completing their family. The bookshelves Miles had built gradually filled with volumes both practical and poetic, a testament to the blending of their different backgrounds and shared love of learning. Westcliff grew into a proper town, with a railway connection and new businesses springing up along the main street. Miles expanded his cattle operation, becoming one of the most successful ranchers in the county. Lillian, though focused primarily on raising their children, remained involved in education, serving on the school board and occasionally substituting when needed. They never forgot the unusual circumstances of their meeting. Each summer, on the anniversary of that fateful day, they would ride out together to the spot on the trail where Miles had found Lillian collapsed from heatstroke. There they would share a picnic lunch and count their blessings, marveling at how close they had come to never finding each other at all. "What if you hadn't decided to take that particular route home?" Lillian would ask. And Miles would always answer the same way. "Some things are meant to be, my love. Some hearts are destined to find each other, no matter what stands in their way." Looking back over the decades of their marriage, through joys and sorrows, through prosperity and hardship, through the raising of children and welcoming of grandchildren, they knew it to be true. Their love story, begun in desperation on a dusty trail beneath the merciless Colorado sun, had blossomed into a life neither could have imagined alone. A life built on courage and kindness, on mutual respect and enduring passion, on the solid foundation of two people who recognized in each other the missing piece of their own hearts. And in the end, that was all any love story could hope to be: the miraculous finding of the one person who makes you whole, who sees you clearly and loves you completely, who pours water on your parched lips when you're dying of thirst and stays beside you through whatever comes after. For Miles and Lillian Bennett, it was enough. It was everything.